What's up guys, Jay's2Cents here, and with some really heavy-hitting games kind of coming out at the end of 2024 and some stuff we're looking forward to in 2025, I kind of want to have a discussion about upgrades that might be necessary to actually play future games. I don't mean like nice to have upgrades. I mean upgrades that might actually truly be necessary. But I just realized I forgot to do something. That'll make a whole lot more sense when you see the Steve and Jay video.
We interrupt this video to bring you a special message from iFixit. No, we interrupt this interruption with this interruption about new stuff from iFixit. We should have a new graphics card, but inventory sucks. Fix the inventory problems with iFixit. Whoa, don't drop it. Can't fix that with iFixit. Just kidding, yes you can. Wish you could take iFixit with you anywhere, but your pockets aren't big enough? Introducing the new More
and the new Minnow.
Take them with you anywhere. So what are you waiting for? Click the link in the description below for discounts and savings and explosions. More explosions. Even more explosions. Why are you still here? Click the description now!
Now that the Heaven benchmark is running in the background, we can kind of talk about necessary upgrades. We've had this conversation a bunch about when should you upgrade your computer and such. And I usually have the very generic answer of when it can't do what you want it to do as fast as you want it to do it, whether it be rendering a video in a certain amount of time, or playing a game at a minimum type of FPS. Games are the driving force of what forces you to have to upgrade your system. The latest game that is actually really sparked a lot of debate about where that cutoff is on supporting previous types of architectures versus required upgrades to get the most out of future titles. And that latest title is Indiana Jones. And the reason why the Indiana Jones title is so controversial is it requires a ray tracing card. Now, by requiring a ray tracing card means you have to be running an RTX 2060 or newer for NVIDIA, or you have to be running an RX 6600 or newer for AMD. That leaves a lot of people out. There are still a lot of people running GTX 1060s or GTX 1660s or 1660 Supers or 1660 Ti's, or heck, might even still be running 5700 XTs for first Navi, first gen Navi GPUs. You know, the RDNA architecture really didn't adopt RT until the 6000 series. So it's one of those games that truly is kind of, and I'm sorry for the squeaky table. Apparently we got very excited yesterday. I don't know. Anyway, it's one of those titles that really is drawing the line now on what is required for playing that title. Now, it's one title. If you're not interested in the Indiana Jones game, it doesn't matter to you. But it kind of gives us an indicator of where developers might be looking at forcing you into upgrades to utilize future architectures. Now, the RT architecture requirement, or the RT core requirement for Indiana Jones is believe it or not about RT itself specifically. It's not about them using it to try and pretty up the game. So there's actually a quote here. Anyway, he's the CTO, or the Chief Technology Officer of Great Circle Developer Machine Game. Here's the reason as to why. This says Indiana Jones and the Great Circle uses a technique called global illumination. It uses hardware ray tracing to calculate the global illumination. While this isn't what players may typically think of as ray tracing, the compatible hardware is required to do it in a performant, high-fidelity way. So they're using the RT cores to calculate global illumination. Now, I know that there's a lot of pushback in consumers to go, I want to play a game and I can't because I don't have hardware that can support it. But it's one of those things where it's unfortunate, but you have to, at some point, prepare and develop for the future. And RT cores that can do more than just quote-unquote ray tracing is kind of the way that developers are starting to utilize that. So this is the first title we've seen that forces you into having ray tracing. So that brings us into the discussion about graphics card updates. So if that title is one that you want to play and you don't have a ray tracing card, the answer is pretty obvious. You have to get a ray tracing card. You can buy an old one, like a 2060 or a 2070 or something like that, just to get into the game's minimum requirements. We'll talk about min requirements versus recommended versus ideal spec or ultra spec, which kind of brings up a whole nother discussion. It's kind of like when rasterization was new. Like when you came from like maybe not you necessarily, but myself specifically, coming from like old Voodoo 3D FX cards and such, and then the GeForce 256, and when rasterization was the buzzwords in the discussion back then, all the complaints, all of the doom and gloom, all of the, oh my God, developers are disconnected, the same exact conversation. The exact same way you're seeing it today was happening in 1999 when this stuff was new. Fast forward 20 years before we started seeing the first RT cards come out, almost 20 years. It's just recycled conversation with the newest, latest, and greatest tech buzzwords and the way that the tech is being utilized moving forward. So no, it's not doom and gloom. It's just unfortunate there has to be a cutoff at some point. So long story short, too late, I know, the driving force behind technology and what is forcing people to have to upgrade is games. I mean, if your system can play any game ever, there would never be any reason to upgrade it, right? And that would be ideal. Unfortunately, that's not reality. So let's go ahead and take a look actually at some of the system requirements on some of these latest games. We'll start with Indiana Jones since I already mentioned it, and the Great Circle. It's pretty intense. Like, it's kind of like Crysis. Now, Crysis in 2007 was actually more of the CryEngine was not only ahead of its time, but it wasn't well optimized. I think we hear that term a lot, but it truly wasn't well optimized, where even modern systems today still get hit pretty hard by the CryEngine, especially CryEngine 1 with Crysis. And that's just because of the fact that it was not an engine that could truly leverage hardware as it got faster and better. So the game just became a meme back in 2007 when memes were barely a thing, to be honest, just because of its difficulty to run, because of the way the engine was designed. Now, if we talk about minimum system requirements right now for Indiana Jones, Windows 10, okay, fine. An i7 10700K or better. Don't forget, we are talking about minimum specs. These are the specs that are required to make the game run at a target 1080p, 60 FPS, low resolution. They put it right on the requirements. 1080, 60, low, a 10700K. Let that sink in for a minute. 16 gigabytes of system memory. That's kind of the standard. I think most people have 16 gigabytes these days. Graphics, RTX 2060 Super. Actually, I said 2060. They're saying 2060 Super 8 gig or better, or an RX 6600 8 gig, or an Intel Arc A580. 120 gigabytes of available space of disk storage. So that's one of the common things we're going to see here is like storage is going to be a driving force too. But when it comes to an upgrade, a lot of people, when it comes to their games, if you play a lot of games and you're like me, you're not good about deleting old games, and you just want to be able to have all your games kind of already preloaded. You don't have to wait for the downloads. Maybe you don't have fast internet connections, so you're not going to easily download a 120 gigabyte game when you decide you want to play it. You want to leave it on your storage. Well, 2 terabytes are starting to become easy to fill up these days. So going with larger storage is definitely a discussion worth having. So that's why I've got some of these Crucial drives on here. We've been using Crucial for years, to be honest. I think their price to storage and speed are definitely worth talking about. Like, all our test benches are using Crucial, our personal systems are using Crucial. And I mean, 4 terabytes at 7,000 megabytes per second. Capacity is number one. If you had to make a trade-off between speed and capacity, I think any NVMe, even a Gen 3 drive, you can still buy Gen 3 drives today, I would prioritize capacity over speed. Because even 3,500 megabytes per second read speed, which is what you get on Gen 3, is going to be so far above and beyond anything you can get on SATA. Because even if you were running, say, a 4 terabyte SATA 2.5-inch SSD, you're still capping at under 600 megabytes per second. So as you can see, you're getting more than 5 times that speed by just moving to NVMe, even if it's a Gen 3 drive. So I would highly recommend a larger NVMe drive, especially if you're running anything on SATA. If you're running a spinning drive, you'll be surprised. A lot of these games say SSD is required, or solid state disk is required. That's just because of the size of the game files when it comes to loading in textures and loading in game scenes. A lot of these games now require an SSD. So don't be that guy, especially if you're in a multiplayer lobby that everyone's waiting on because your spinning drive is having a heck of a time trying to load large game files. So NVMe, even Gen 3, is definitely something I would highly recommend. But the 16 gigabytes of VRAM being a minimum, that's kind of crazy, right? The recommended This is if you were looking for high resolution or high preset 1440p native, that means no upscaling, and 60 FPS. Remember, 60 FPS is the target here, not 120 or 144, which are these high, these high refresh rate monitors. 60 is all we're targeting here. A 12700K. So we jumped up 2 generations on CPU requirement. 3.6 gigahertz or better. A Ryzen 7 7700 or better. System memory, 32 gigs of system RAM. Now here's where you start to go, okay, 16 gigabytes has kind of become like the minimum standard when it comes to most gaming PCs ever since kind of DDR4 launched. 32 gigabytes of system RAM. That is starting to become, once again, a limiting factor for a lot of people on their gaming PCs when it comes to being able to run certain titles. This isn't the only title that requires 32 gigs of RAM. Also, too, like Flight Sim 24 also requires 32 gigabytes of RAM. GPU, a 3080 Ti 12 gig or a 7700 XT 12 gig or better. Now, the reason why you're going to notice like this weird discrepancy of like, wait, a 7700 XT and a 3080 Ti. Those are two. There's a huge discrepancy between the two of those cards when it comes to the performance of those cards, but you'll notice it's the 12 gigabytes of VRAM that they're really targeting here. So that's why you'll kind of notice these big gaps in like a 2060 Super versus a 6600. Like those two cards are not identical performing. It really is coming down to the VRAM of the 3080 Ti at 12 gigs versus 7700 XT at 12 gigs. Now, I'll tell you right now, in terms of a GPU recommendation, we have this card. We actually bought this card, the 7900 GRE, the Power Color Hellhound. There's other GRE brands. This isn't a sponsored bit or anything. It's just, you can do your own research. You are gonna have a hard time finding a better rounded, like performance value than the 16 gigabyte 7900 GRE AMD card. Do yourself a favor. Consider this card if you're looking at upgrading into a newer graphics card that will exceed the minimum specs and more often than not exceed the recommended specs at a price to performance. I mean, the card can be had in the 500s. I know it sounds like a lot, but it's a 7900, 16 gigabytes of VRAM and the GRE. So it is a heck of a value when it comes to its price to performance. Like, that's just my recommendation. I recommend this card all the time to people that are looking for an upgrade that isn't $1,000 4080 or something like that. So we'll compare Microsoft Flight Sim 2020, which they're now calling 40th Anniversary Edition. They used to call it 2020. Now it's called 40th Anniversary. So we're comparing the 2020 to 2024. It was easy, right? The processor was i5 4460, Ryzen 3 1200. Those are very old processors by today's standards, about 10 years old. 8 gigabytes of RAM. I mean, everyone has 8 gigabytes of RAM pretty much these days. A GTX 770 or an RX 570. I mean, 150 gigabytes of available space though. That's because back then it didn't stream a lot of the map data. It actually stored it locally. And then it would kind of update itself via the web. But anyway, 150 gigabytes of local storage. Recommended though, i5 8400 or Ryzen 5 1500X, 16 gigabytes of system RAM, a GTX 970, which we know is 3.5 gigabytes, not even a whole 4, but whatever, an RX 590, again, 150 gigabytes of available storage. Doesn't say SSD is required. If you've played the simulator, you know an SSD is definitely recommended. So let's compare those to Flight Simulator 2024. Remember, this is only 4 years later. Flight Sim 2024, its minimum is a Ryzen 5 2600X or a Core i7 6800K. Okay, nothing too crazy to write home about there. 16 gigabytes of system RAM. Okay, we're getting kind of more towards that industry standard at this point. An RX 5700 or a GTX 970. Again, not a lot has changed in terms of the minimum specs. Version DirectX 12, 50 gigabytes of available space, but now it's required that you have a broadband internet connection. Now the reason for that, and it's a minimum 10 megabit per second of bandwidth speed. The reason for that, and the reason why the storage is so small, is because of the fact that it live streams in the topical map data for where you're flying in real time. So that's one of the ways they tried to make it smaller on the requirement for your disk space, but it's a way for you to always have the latest map information, is instead of having to download that as an update to the title, it's downloading it in real time when you load the flight. So broadband internet connection is required. Recommended though, not a whole lot changing on the CPU side, a Ryzen 7 2700X or a 10700K, but 32 gigabytes of system RAM. So we talked about that once again. And the same 50 gigabytes of local storage plus broadband internet connection speed. There's a couple of other honorable mentions here though, before we talk about some of the recommendations I have for system upgrades. So Stalker 2's minimum requirements are an i7 7700K or a Ryzen 5 1600X, 16 gigabytes of RAM, a 1066 gigabyte. I actually am noting that because you might have a 1060, but you could have a 3 gigabyte version. So you might find that you're actually under spec even though you have what is called the right GPU. It's one of those moves NVIDIA made back in the day I highly disagreed with by calling it any 1066 gig or a 1063 gig the same name. It's disingenuous. They also had a lesser core count. Want to point that out. Anyway, RX 580 8 gig or an ARC A750. 160 gigabytes of available space. So do you see the trend now of the size of the game improving or increasing? For preset low, 1080p, target 30 FPS, by the way, they're targeting 30 FPS, which is weird. You need 16 gigabytes of dual channel RAM and SSD is required. The recommended starts to get a bit beefier, an i7 11700 or a Ryzen 7 5800X, 32 gigabytes of system RAM, a 3070 Ti or an RTX 4070 or an AMD, a 6800 XT. The reason for that is the amount of VRAM on those cards, as we've already talked about. 160 gigabytes of disk storage, and then that is for targeting preset high 1440p at 60 FPS. And SSDs are required. So that really shows you that I think what is starting to become the limiting factor for many people is going to be storage, speed, and capacity. System RAM capacity. Speed is less important than capacity when it comes to these games that have these requirements, or GPU VRAM. So these are usually, you can see now some of these CPUs are still pretty old on the recommendations. So like if you were to throw new RAM in there, right? You know, crucial spot here, obviously the Crucial DDR5 Pro we're using on our test benches, all of our test benches. These are 6400 mega transfers. Not the fastest timings, they're 38 and 40. Those can be tightened up if we slow down the RAM a little bit. But 32 gigabytes is kind of becoming the standard, as you can see. So you might find yourself, if you adopted DDR5 when it was newer, 32 gigabytes, you could easily find in two 16 gigabyte sticks. Most of the sticks actually are 16 gigabyte sticks these days. You can find 8 gigs. You might be running 16 gigs of VRAM, or excuse me, system RAM. I would personally recommend selling those and buying a 32 gig set that is 2 sticks instead of relying on 4 sticks for the discussion we've talked about for a long time. Mixing and matching 2 stick sets together usually is not recommended on most motherboard QVLs or the verification list when it comes to RAM support. It's recommended that your kits be matched. So that would mean if you were gonna run a 4 DIMM stick set, you would want to have bought a 4 DIMM set. So adding 2 more to it, you can do that, but you would typically have to then run the slower speeds. You may not be able to get Expo or XMP speeds to run on that. Graphics cards, I've already talked about the fact that I have a hard time not recommending the RX 7900 GRE, 16 gigabytes of VRAM. It is a much more price reasonable card than the NVIDIA brethren it has in the same sort of speed and VRAM capacity. And then obviously your storage capacity over speed. And I would say the same thing for the RAM, honestly. If I had to make a choice between going with 32 gigabytes, a 6400 38, which is what this is, and I couldn't afford that, instead of going with a 16 gig kit, I would drop those speeds down to like 5600. They're actually becoming harder to find, like slower RAM speeds, because they've progressed so far since DDR5 has come out, that usually you can find 6000 set, maybe even faster timings, like a CL36 or even a CL32, at significantly cheaper prices. As the mega transfers go up, the price goes up, but as the timings get tighter, the price goes up even more. So these games are definitely needing the capacity of the RAM to store the amount of information that the game is needing in terms of texture loading and all that, not just on GPU VRAM, but also system RAM. Capacity would be king over the fastest speeds. So if I couldn't afford the faster RAM I would definitely go with the most RAM that I could afford in the category that we need it to. So 32 gigs is now like the standard, as you can see. I think you're gonna probably see in the next few years, 32 gigs be the minimum, 64 be the recommended. So anyway, I hope that's given some food for thought when it comes to upgrading your system. CPU and motherboard platform, probably the last thing you would need to upgrade. Power supply, more than likely the last thing you need to upgrade unless you're making a huge jump on your power supply to something that isn't supported or is outside of the recommended minimum for your graphics card. Cooler, if you're not upgrading your CPU and your cooler's fine, no reason to touch that. But those are the three main things I think people are gonna find themselves upgrading in 2025. Potentially their graphics card, but more than likely their storage capacity and their RAM capacity. But I'll put links to some recommendations I have down below, and of course the crucial for sponsoring today's video and this discussion about games and how they are driving the necessity for upgrades. And you guys can find links to the product we talked about in the description below, and you can formulate your own opinions based on the tech spreadsheet or tech sheets and all that, and determine what makes the most sense for you. So I'm curious, conversation time, in the comments down below, what is the last game that forced you to upgrade? I don't mean what game did you say, oh, it's not quite running as fast as I want it to, so I'm gonna make an upgrade. No, what game were you just so blatantly out of the minimum that you went, it's time to upgrade? What game was that? When was that? And what were the specs? It'd be interesting to see what the kind of general consensus is and what that time frame is. I have an idea in my head on what games have kind of forced people to have to upgrade, but I'm kind of curious as to what your guys' experiences were. Anyway, guys, thanks for watching. Sound off down below, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.